So imagine this wedding feast for which all those who are directly invited don't want to attend. And in the parable, we can likely recognize that the invited guests are the Israelites. We see the story where the master sends servants out yet again. He keeps inviting them because Israel had this very complicated relationship with God in the Old Testament. And even though they were continually unfaithful, he kept on sending prophets and he kept on trying to reach out to them. God, of course, revealed himself first to the Israelites, and he made his covenant with them first. So he prepared the wedding feast of the promised land for them. And as I said, he kept on trying to keep them faithful to that covenant, but they decided to worship other gods instead. So God expanded the invitation list to include the Gentiles, which of course is just about all of us here in this church right now. One thing was for sure. Notice at the beginning that this is addressed to the chief priests and the elders of the people. When they saw that, while they might not have heeded the call to love each other, to love themselves as they love God, which for them, when they were thinking of who others they were supposed to treat well, they usually just thought that applied to Jews. But they certainly knew how to exclude people who weren't like themselves, which for them was not just Gentiles, but tax collectors and prostitutes and all other assorted unclean people, sinners. So this reminds me a lot of what happens in our world today. How often do we hear complaints about how either our church or our country is filling up with people who don't look or sound like the rest of us? But here's the sad truth. The native-born American Catholics are fleeing the church in droves. The Lord invites them every day to his Eucharistic feast, but they have better things to do. And I'm not referring to the people who work every day and they can't make daily Mass, or even shift workers for whom Sunday Mass is a challenge. I'm referring to Catholics who rarely or never go to church. These are folks who were raised Catholic. They were given this invitation from the beginning of their lives. But they say no. And needless to say, they don't raise their children Catholic. But our Lord's feast will not be denied. Everyone is indeed invited. And so if those who received an engraved invitation from their infancy decline the offer, then God will easily accommodate whoever he finds willing to accept the invitation. In other words, this Eucharistic feast is here, and it's available to all comers. There's not one person whom God does not wish to share his beautiful and magnificent, bountiful gift of his body and blood for their spiritual nourishment and sustenance and for their salvation. Now that brings me to what might be the seemingly disturbing end of this parable. This poor chap who came to the feast without a wedding garment. Now, one might imagine that this unlucky fellow had just been brought in off the street, dressed as he was, so why would the king blame him for his inappropriate attire? But the theological point here is actually tied to the early part of the parable. Just because you're invited does not mean you get to set the terms of the event. Everyone remains subject to the law of God. This is still the king's feast, and it is his banquet hall. The original guests would surely have understood this. In fact, their unwillingness to abide by the rules of the house likely played a key role in their decision to turn down the invitation. They knew the rules of the feast. In our case, today, we know the rules of the Christian life. But they had higher priorities, one to his farm, another to his business. In each instance, the cares or the allurements of this world took precedence. In other words, their wills took precedence over God's. But for the guests who did come, the same set of rules still applied. By implication, all the other guests were properly dressed for the occasion. They came to our Lord's feast, surrendering themselves to the will of the Master. They accepted not only the invitation, but the call to live and love one another as joyful guests at the banquet. And so for us, the same holds true. Every one of us here received our Lord's invitation to the feast. Every one of us opened the envelope and we RSVP'd in the affirmative, and we came to the feast. Those who understand God's offer and God's terms and choose to accept them now just need to add the final piece of the puzzle. We must seek to follow God's will in everything, lest we become either like the improperly dressed guest, trying to place our will over God's, or worse, we become just like those who turned down the invitation in the first place.